Welcome back, boils and ghouls. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, do me a favor and hit that like button. Think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. Share these videos with your friends. And if you really enjoy what you see, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you want to support the channel, you can use the links below to pick up your very own Uncle Jerk's Comic Book Corner t-shirt, as designed by the Canadian sensation himself, James Edward Clark. Every dollar goes to upgrading equipment and more source material for better and more comprehensive videos, but now it is interview time. Don Chin is either a name that you're instantly familiar with or you've never heard of. At least you think you've never heard of. Chances are, though, if you started digging through your long boxes, his name would pop up more than a few times. Don Chin is an accomplished writer in a number of different genres, but is definitely best remembered for the self-published Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters title. Originally, though, fresh out of high school, Don Chin started a comic book store with a little loan from his parents and parlayed that into his true end goal of writing comic books. Chin then published Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters himself after observing the monumental success of Eastman and Laird's independently published Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles while running his own shop. And while they obviously all had high hopes, Don Chin, and everyone else for that matter, were absolutely floored when more than 50,000 copies of the first issue sold. Riding the success of that first issue, the project quickly transformed from the planned miniseries into a regular ongoing title. Chris Parsonovich, the original artist, quickly fell behind schedule though, and meeting deadlines was becoming near impossible after only a handful of issues. In a fateful move and a desperate gambit to get anyone to take over art duties on the book, Don Chin called up a young artist that he'd ran into frequently at the numerous artist alleys he used to roam during its constant visits to conventions. Having earned a reputation for his extremely high-quality inking on Matt Wagner's incredible Mage the Hero discovered a short time before, following years of struggling to break into the industry, Sam Kieth was finally getting job offers, but they were all inking jobs. Kieth was chomping at the bit to do pencils, really get a chance to truly learn his craft. Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters, as unlikely a place as it might seem, would prove to be the testing ground where Kieth quickly and quietly refined his skills, eventually honing them to a razor's edge. During his brief run on Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters, a job for which Kieth seems to be eternally grateful for to this day, he created images and layouts that he would continue to utilize and reference for nearly 2 decades as he rose through the ranks of DC and was then skyrocketed to success with his Marvel Comics Presents covers and his creator-owned image creation, The Maxx. For years in the interviews, Kieth has talked extremely highly of the man who gave him that first opportunity at penciling and really opened the door for him to start his comic book career. Living up to his reputation, when Don Chin came across one of my posts about the first part of the Maxx series videos, he instantly offered up scans of an interview that he conducted with Kieth himself years before that I was completely unaware of, as well as names of other people I could reach out to and talk to about Kieth. Seizing the opportunity, I quickly decided to try and rope him into an interview. Thankfully, Chin agreed, and we spent a few hours talking about his life, his work, and particularly Sam Kieth at this early and pivotal stage in his career. There's a lot more to Don Chin than just Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters, or even Sam Kieth, though. By the height of the 1990s comic book boom, Don Chin was operating not one but 2 successful comic imprints, Parody Press and Entity Comics, and Don Chin has worked with some truly phenomenal talent over the years, including Doug TenNapel of Earthworm Jim fame, and he happened to be one of the first people to give Marvel Comics wonderkind Leinel Francis Yu and his studio Cat work here in the United States. This is not to mention the fact that he helped print the legendary Megaton comics, which launched the careers of not only Erik Larsen, but Rob Liefeld as well. Following a hiatus from the industry after the crash of the comics market in the late 90s, Chin is getting back into the comic game and is extremely busy launching several new books as well as his own YouTube channel. I'll make sure to stick links to everything in the description below, but for now, let's kick back, relax, and learn a little bit about one of the nicest and most underappreciated guys in comic books today. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, you have to have been into comics for quite a while, because I found out, I was doing a little bit of research, and I found out you actually owned a comic shop for a while. What got you into comics to begin with? When did you get into comics?
Well, Roman, I think if I can remember, it was there was a Mattel set of Peanuts collections, and they were little hardbound books that were flip covers, and there was about 7 or 8 volumes in a little box, and I got that as a gift, and I just devoured Peanut strips till the spines wore off on those, and I would trace Charlie Brown and Snoopy, and just to kind of pass the time. So I kind of remember that as a young child. That was kind of my entry into loving comics and comic strips. And then as I got older, I was reading comics, but mainly like funny animals like Harvey, Richie Rich, age appropriate stuff for someone that was like 7 or 8. And then as I got older and became a teenager, I got introduced to superheroes in junior high school. And a friend of mine had a brother who had an old Batman comic that was like 12 cents, and he wanted a few bucks for it. So I bought that, and just the nostalgia of owning an old, 60s comic, I just kind of got the bug then. I used to watch Batman, the show with Adam West in the 60s, and I grew up in the late 60s, but I really didn't collect until junior high school. So I started amassing this huge collection, and by the time I was in college, I probably had as many boxes as what you have behind you. And I thought, well, no one else has a comic book store up here in Northern California where I live. And I was still living with my parents while I was going to college. I went to a college called Humboldt State University. And so my parents had a game room with a ping pong table on a part of their house where you could get to without going through the front door. You'd have to kind of walk through this gravelly path with a rose garden, and there was this game room, and they had a ping pong table, pool table. And so I thought, well, why don't I just try placing an order with one of these distributors, and just trying my hand at opening a comic book store with low overhead. So I did that, and I just put an ad in a classified newspaper. And within, a few weeks, I was getting regular customers coming into my parents' house, into this makeshift comic book store. And it was called Comic Castle. And from that point of origin in my parents' house, we expanded, and we eventually went into a retail store in downtown Eureka, California. So it was probably in the early 80s. I was just kind of getting out of college, and that's I stuck my foot into the comic book retail ring. And I did that for probably about 6 years full time. And then I had a partner. And when I got into comics writing, I segued out of retail into actual publishing and writing. So my first stuff was with Eclipse, but that wasn't my very first published work. It was with Cracked, which was kind of a Mad Magazine. I'm sorry about that. A Mad Magazine type of, newsstand periodical. I don't know if you've seen Cracked. You probably have.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of my origin with the comic book store. And then, with the comics, I just started reading a lot of Marvels and DCs and collected those. And the comic book store ran for maybe 15 years. And most of that was with a partner of mine that took over the business. So Comic Castle is no longer in Northern California, but it had a good run. And then the owner of that eventually moved to Las Vegas. So he no longer continued the shop.
So what prompted the transition from, were you always planning on going into writing whenever you started? You know, it kind of sounds like the shop kind of naturally evolved out of you just being like, well, I got this collection, might as well make a little bit of money off of it. Were you always planning on leaving that and going into writing, or was that something that just kind of naturally happened?
The dream to get into comics was before the comic book store, because I always was doing my own comic book adventures on typing paper and stuff. So my dream was to get published. And me and Personovich, when we were in high school, he's the guy that drew the hamsters. We were way into Heavy Metal magazine. We bought that magazine voraciously. You can see Mobius's influence a lot in Personovich's work. And so he wanted to be just like him, and I wanted to just write comics, and we thought we could make it a go. So we would send off our submissions to these publishers, and we'd get rejected. And looking back on the stuff that I sent in, when you're in high school, you kind of have a lot of cojones, and you think you're better than you actually are. And so I would send off this stuff to, like, Mike Friedrich was a guy who was doing kind of an underground science fiction fantasy comic called Star Reach, and it had like Jim Starlin in it, and it's kind of an undergroundy thing. So Personovich and I kind of got our feet wet. I loved superheroes and funny animals and everything, but he and I both kind of had a happy medium because we liked the fantasy stuff like Von Baudet and Mobius, and Richard Corbin was another guy that was awesome. And so we liked that magazine a lot. And so when we were in high school, we wanted to kind of emulate them. And since we were getting rejected, we thought, well, maybe we should just self-publish. So Overload was a magazine we did like towards my senior year of high school, and my parents footed the bill. It was a black and white, kind of an oversized magazine size comic book. And the very first thing that Personovich and I ever did was a spoof of the movie Alien. And it's definitely a kind of an R-rated comic. It's not for general audiences. They had a lot of swearing and stuff in it. But Overload kind of eventually evolved into 5 issues. And by the time we got to our 4th issues, we actually had a comic book distributor. And so that kind of got our feet wet. And so we thought, well, maybe we should try to promote the comic book, to conventions. And back in the 80s, most of the people would come down to San Francisco and go to the creation cons. And that's where I met, people like Sam and the people that have Eclipse Comics, Kat Ironwood and Dean Mulaney. I kind of met them because we were just these struggling high school wannabe cartoonists that just had Overload. And I think I had an issue of, this was like the very last issue of Overload, which is, it's black and white. And it's kind of like we called it the fantasy humor magazine. So it's like, what if you took Mad Magazine and Heavy Metal together? And so.
That is an awesome concept.
Yeah, so that's what we tried to get off the ground. And it never made any money. My parents were really nice, and, they were taking a loss on it. But it helped me to get my feet wet and learn that when you do comic books, a lot of people think, well, I'm just going to print several thousand of these, and I know I'm going to be able to sell them. And that was the very first mistake I made with Overload. Was we printed the comics before we had any orders, and I thought I was just going to send these to distributors and they would send me money, but that's not the way it works. You have to solicit your book, show them copies of what you've got in progress, and then they advertise it in the catalogs like previews, and then it goes to your comic book stores, and then they place the orders accordingly. But I had it backwards when I was in high school. I thought, well, I'm just going to print these. I'll sell them, no problem. So I shipped them up and I sent them down to the distributor without really checking to see if they liked it. And they said, well, we don't think you're quite ready. So they sent them back to me. So that was a lesson in humility.
That's it. I want to point out too, though, for a lot of people watching this, like you're like, I had it all backwards, but you went out and you did it, and you actually got the experience, and I think that's probably one of the things that helped. I mean, if I was to guess, propel you further along and prove to yourself, like, no, this is an attainable goal. I can do this. People these days now get so much hung up on like, oh, well, I'm only going to print 6 microzines and distribute them to 5 guys, in South California. They can't put themselves out there enough to actually get something done. And I think that's something that separates. Was this right around, this is the 80s, so it's the black and white explosion, underground is going on. Is this before or after the Turtles?
Overload was, the first issue was 1979, so I was
Oh, wow, okay.
So even before that, actually I shouldn't say before that. So we kind of did Overload, and then there was a lull. I mean, I think the last issue of Overload was probably like in the 80 or 81. And so at that time I was just getting out of high school and going into college. So that's where I started opening the comic book store, but I was still trying to do freelance writing. And so Parsonovich and I would actually create our own underground comics. They were called New Wave comics. And there was this guy named Clay Geertz, who was this really influential underground New Wave comics promoter down in the Bay Area. So he had this kind of little typewritten newsletter he would send out to budding comic book people. And he would just encourage people to try to trade and sell their comic books through his newsletter. And he would self-publish people like me and Parsonovich in these little things called mini comics. And so there's this, if you go into the underground price guide that I think Jay Kennedy created, you'll probably see some of the stuff that Parsonovich and I did. He did like a guy named Stoner Man, and I had these just little 8-page anthologies of one panel cartoons that were, based on video games or pop culture. But they were edgy. They weren't, they weren't for kids. They were mainly, there was some nudity in some of the mini comics and some swearing and stuff. But for the most part, we kept it clean after Overload, and then we just kind of got, after we did these New Wave underground comics, we kind of got it out of our system, and then the Hamsters kind of came into play because I was a comic book store owner, and I was noticing everybody was talking about the Ninja Turtles, and this was, these 2 guys were doing this pretty crude looking black and white comic that everybody wanted. So I finally got a copy of the Turtles by Eastman and Laird, and I really liked it, because it had a lot of action, and it was really raw and gritty. And so during a college biology class, I was just kind of doodling, and I thought, what if we took the Turtles like one step further? So I came up with the adolescent radioactive black belt hamsters, and I went to Parsonovich and I said, you want to draw this? And he goes, sure. So he drew it, and then we sent it into Eclipse Comics, who we had met through the convention circuit. And they're in, at the time they were in Guerneville, California, which is not that far from where I live. I live in Eureka right now, and I always pretty much have. And Guerneville is only like 3 hours driving from Eureka. So to have a pretty major comic book publisher in your neck of the woods was unusual. And they kind of had an earthy hippie vibe to them, and really laid back, which was unlike Marvel and DC, which were, the suit and tie, prim and proper Wall Street, Madison Avenue guys. So I didn't think the Hamsters were going to be a fit for, the major publishers, but I thought an indie might take a chance on us. So we sent in copies of the artwork and the concept to Eclipse, and lo and behold, they called me back and they said, yeah, we like this. We'd like to distribute it for you. So they solicited the book, and I think the orders, Roman, were like 53,000 copies of the first issue, which was, for a couple of guys that no one knew, it really blew Eclipse away. They didn't think it was going to be that big of a hit. So it just flew off the shelves and everybody was speculating on it. And I heard it, the first issue was up to like $70 in some places. And so after that first issue came out, Eclipse said, well, why don't we make this a regular series? Because they knew they could make money on it. And the funny thing though, Roman, is that they said, we'll distribute it for you. We won't publish it for you. So that was kind of unusual. I thought, well, maybe, you know, they're willing to take a chance on me, but they don't want to print it.
That's what I was just thinking. What?
So the good thing was that they're giving me a bigger cut because they're just taking a distribution fee. But
Okay.
the bad thing is I have to go to my parents and say, hey, Mom and Dad, I got this comic book I have to print 56,000 copies of. Can you loan me like $20,000 to print it? So I took this project into a local printer, and I think they told me this was the biggest single project they'd ever printed for somebody outside of, you know, a newspaper. So I remembered being in the loading docks, you know, packing these books, you know, tons and tons of boxes and Hamsters books, and just shipping them off to different distributors. And it was, you know, I definitely got my hands dirty on that. But when they said, well, we'll publish it from here on out, I thought, oh, I could handle that, because I don't really want to be down at the printers doing that again.
That's rough work, man. I mean, for anybody who's like trying to conceptualize this, the biggest selling Marvel stuff right now sits at about 35,000 copies a month. So you're almost double their highest selling, you know, say Venom. You doubled the sales on that. You're trying to package it and mail it. Oh, that is brutal.
And you got long boxes right next to you. I can see that. So like they hold like maybe 350 copies or something. Is that?
Yeah, right around there. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you can imagine, let's see, how many 350 times, you know, we're talking about 100 of those would be like
3,500. Yeah.
Or 35,000, right? No, 3,500.
3,500.
Yeah. So that's a lot of books.
That's a ridiculous amount of books.
Yeah, it was fun though, but it was just mainly me, and I don't think I remember seeing Parsonovich down at the printing. He just kind of took the money and ran.
So he did the first 4 issues, right? Of Radioactive?
We had a kind of a fill-in group. I don't think he was ready for, you know, he and I were both he was kind of a slacker. I was kind of more of your yuppie kind of guy that wanted to, you know, make money and stuff. So he and I, if you saw us together, you go, how can these two guys work together? Because this guy looks like a real clean cut, you know, conservative guy. This other guy looks like he's homeless. But we had this love of comics, and even though we grew up totally different, we just hit it off, and we loved working off each other. And you can see that in the comics, as we put ourselves in the book, and we're always kind of riffing on each other, and, you know, maybe about his hygiene or my, you know, my capitalism. So you know, it was fun. And so when we went to him after the first issue was so big, you know, he agreed to try to do the best that he could. So he did number 2, and then we could kind of tell the writing on the wall by how long it took him to do number 2. We need to get some help. So on number 3, some local guys I pulled together, actually, and Mike Dringenberg, who went on to do Enchanter with me, but most people will know him from Sandman with Neil Gaiman and Sam.
Wow. So is that where Sam met Mike at originally then, or did they already know each other?
I think if I can recall, I probably met Sam at one of those conventions in the Bay Area, because in the 80s he was trying to get his start. He was inking Mage, and I knew him from that. And so when I saw him at a con, I think he was just at a drawing table, you know, probably in the Bay Area or Sacramento at one of these cons. And, you know, there would be guys like Mike Mignola and Art Adams. And, you know, I would buy these guys pinups for like $20 at the time. And now I wish I would still have them, because I know they'd be worth a lot. This is like in the 80s when they weren't really getting published anywhere. But they were just these guys trying to make a living. And you could tell when you saw Art Adams stuff, you said, I went, this guy's going to be big. And before long, he was just in a fanzine called High Energy. He was doing some stuff in that. But then just after the conventions, he probably showed his stuff to people. And then not long after that, I saw he was drawing Long Shot, which was a pretty cool miniseries from Marvel. And then Sam was kind of in the same boat. He was young, just trying to get his feet wet. So I met him, and I recognized him from Mage, and we kind of hit it off, and we were just kind of keeping in touch. And so after Hamsters 4 came out, Parsanovich basically said, I don't think I can keep drawing. Actually, I think he came in, I think he drew 5 as well. So he did 4 issues, but then one of the issues, number 3, was kind of a fill-in with a guy named Herb Wood, Mike Dringenberg, and then just to kind of keep the flavor, we would have Parsanovich draw like a panel every so often, so people would still know that he's still around. But so we did 5 issues of Hamsters with Parsanovich, and we were trying to make it like bi-monthly, but it was hard. It's hard to pull everything together that quickly. But I thought, Eclipse said, well, we can't, if you don't have Parsanovich, do you have any ideas on who might be a good fit? And I've been talking to Sam, and he wasn't really doing anything on a regular basis. And I think he really wanted to, test his talent on a real project. So I called him and I said, hey, Sam, do you want to draw the Hamsters? And he said, yeah. So I started working with him, and we had an inker, a couple different inkers that were really good. John Nyberg was the guy that inked some of Sam's stuff, and he was somebody that I found that was doing, I think he was inking Nexus for First Comics at the time. And then another guy named Sam De La Rosa was a guy that inked some of Sam's work. And Sam De La Rosa had Marvel credits. And just somehow I met these guys, they didn't really have the internet back then. I think we just kind of either knew each other from fan, conventions, or we would just keep in touch. And, you just kind of keep a person's phone number, and then the stars align, and, Sam was available. And I was so happy because I loved his work, and it's so much different than Parsanovich. Some people say that, oh, I like Parsanovich's style better. And then some people say, well, I really like Sam's style better. But I think both of them had their strengths, and they're both great talents.
Yeah, I mean, like, whenever you read interviews with Sam, he rarely brings up anybody that he works with. He just doesn't like to talk about people that he works with, because it seems like he's got real low self-esteem, kind of beats himself up a lot about about a lot of stuff. But you're a constant name that always comes up, and he speaks really highly of you, because he literally says, like, I think I found 8 interviews where he's like, he was the only guy who would let me pencil. I just wanted to hug him. It was so amazing. And you look at his work, and he had a lot to offer. I just think a lot of it boiled down, as far as you talking about the stars aligning, I think a lot of it boils down to you having a really good eye for guys. Moving forward, you always had a good eye for guys. You weren't telling derivative stories either. It always felt like Radioactive was kind of doing its own thing and growing out of, apart from its name, really growing out of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, as opposed to doing a straight parody or some, hackneyed attempt at cashing in on that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I usually only spoof things that I really like. And after I read the Turtles, the Hamsters is really nothing like the Turtles, but other than in name. But I love the characters, and I try to infuse each one with a little bit of my own personality. And I think that's kind of what people see is I still get fan mail, people telling me that, this is my favorite character. And this is like, 30, 40 years ago. And I'm still amazed that people remember them. And, we're getting, I think Bleeding Cool or somebody just did a story about, hamsters, where are they now? Just like in the last month. So they still have kind of a cult following. But as far as Sam goes, I grew up reading a lot of Creepy magazine, Roman, and Swamp Thing with Bernie Wrightson. And so when I saw Sam's stuff, the pencil stuff that he did, I thought, wow, this is really cool because he's kind of got this creepy vibe, and he's got the muscles and kind of that cool organic feel to him that Wrightson has. And I was a huge Wrightson fan. So when I saw Sam's work, I thought, wow, this guy, I know this guy, and he draws like, as good as Bernie, and he's got these cool, attention to detail with those cool bristles and, the hair and all that stuff. And so Hamsters is kind of like in between, because you can tell nowadays he is so refined and razor sharp. And I think Hamsters was just kind of his exploration phase of his career. He was just, this is the first thing I get to pencil. It's a little goofy, but you can still see hints of what he was going to do for Marvel and for Max and Batman and stuff in the Hamsters. In fact, I think in the Hamsters there's even like little Iz's in the early on in like number 6 or 7, and I kind of asked him what those were, and he said, well, it's kind of a secret. And then Infidel Castro, I think, is the villain that we had in the latter issues of the Hamsters that Sam drew, and he looks a lot like is it Mr. Gone? Is that the protagonist? Yeah,
Yep.
If you look at Infidel Castro, he looks like Frank Zappa, and then Mr. Gone kind of looks like Frank Zappa,
Yeah, well, Sam had said, like, for years prior to the Max really blowing up, that if he ever got a chance, he was going to take everything he'd ever done and throw it into one comic book. And if you ever read anything that Sam writes nowadays, he talks a lot about the Trout-averse, and that kind of is an evolution of that idea. And Max had shown up previously as Max the Hare in Comico Primer 5. The Is that shows up, I believe you're right, he's in issue 6, and then again, I think in issue 8 or 9, not that I'm obsessed, but like 8 or 9, and he also shows up in an issue of Critters that Sam had done. He did a gorgeous cover that's got an Is on it, and there's and I for sure know that he has confirmed that Mr. Gone did definitely appear in Radioactive. If you look at some of those covers, you can tell Sam is definitely exploring and learning. And there's a couple of those covers that I still think these days, collectors kind of overlook them because they see that name in the price guide and gloss over them. And when they see those covers, whoo, he was excited to be on that book, man.
Pulled some of the back issues. Like this was 6, which was his very first cover for Eclipse. And then number 7 I thought was pretty awesome. The one where he's
that's still one of my all-time favorite Kieth covers. I mean, the layout of that, you would see him repeat that for 30 years.
Yeah, that was like the Toe Jam monsters from Atlantis. He was fun. He would always, when we were plotting the issues, I think he and I both came up with like the Toe Jam monsters from Atlantis. We just thought, well, we can have this hulking monster, but he's got this fetish for Toe Jam, and we went with it. Anyways, Sam was awesome. He's a real kick, and he's very shy. Like you said, he's very introverted, and not, doesn't have an ego for sure.
That's one thing I wanted to ask you about. We chatted a little bit before this started, and I told you I got over 60,000 hits on that Sam Kieth video. And one thing that kept popping up in the comments was that people think Sam Kieth is putting on a persona for interviews. He has a tendency to be very, like, self-effacing, and he's very shy. And I just was wondering, this is early on in his career, but I know that even speaking from guys, like I'm getting ready to interview Bill Messner-Loebs as well, and like speaking to those guys, it seems very apparent that even though he was excited and interested in getting out there in comics, he was a very introverted guy. Can you talk a little bit just about working with him? How much input did he have on the book as well? You talked about plotting with him.
Yeah. With Parsonovich, I would just kind of type a script and give it to Par, and he would just kind of do it panel by panel. And he would throw in his own little things here and there, kind of like Sergio Aragones did in Mad, in the little areas between the panels and stuff. But with Sam, it was almost kind of like, we kind of co-plotted. I don't think he got credit for that, but he had a lot more say in the story. There's one device in the story arc with the death of Bruce, which he drew, and we've got this kind of floating. It's almost like a drone, but it was like. Did you see the movie Phantasm?
Oh my God, that's one of my favorite movies of all time. Don Coscarelli. Yeah.
I loved those little cheesy movies, horror movies growing up. And so Phantasm was a huge influence on me, and the Beastmaster as well. And so as a homage to the Phantasm orb, I thought, well, let's put in this thing. I think it's called the Ginsu 2000 or something, but it would float around and it was trying to keep the hamsters under the water in Fidel Castro's, secret hideaway. So it was just kind of this built-in robot that was sent to monitor things and make sure things were fine in the lair of infidel Castro. But that was something I think he and I kind of worked on together, was making this orb that had blades and stuff coming out. And he was along for the ride. He was very easy to work with, and just a lot of fun. I mean, we probably racked up huge long distance bills. He and me and Dringenberg. Dringenberg didn't work on the hamsters except for maybe doing a cover here and there, and he also inked the Clint miniseries. But we would, back then, we didn't have email, so if we had to talk about something, we'd have to call long distance. And Sam was in California, Mike was in Utah, so I would have these huge long distance bills because we didn't have cell phones back then. It was just your landline. But Sam was on the same time zone with me. He was kind of a Northern California guy. I think he grew up in Sacramento, and I don't know if he's still married. Do you know, Roman, if he is?
Oh, absolutely, and he's still with that same woman, and that's a kind of a recurring. Yeah, he's definitely still with her.
Okay, so I think at the time when I met Sam, he was with this woman, and I think she was considerably older than him.
That's the thing, yeah.
I never met her. She never got on the phone. If I can recall, this is like going way back, like in the 80s, but I think he had a lot of animals. Like, does he ever talk about like his exotic pets or anything?
No, I've heard him mention pets a lot, and there's a recurring theme that pops up in his work a lot where animals take on a very humanistic quality. I mean, the Maxx, obviously, and all of the subtext there, but even before that, he's been very animistic, and I always assumed the animals played pretty heavily into him and his wife's relationship, because they've talked about not wanting to have kids because of them being uncomfortable with their relationship and how it's perceived. So they kind of surrogate animals for children in a lot of ways, from what I understand.
Okay, because I can just kind of recall having conversations with Sam and hearing lots of birds or something. I mean, this is like, I haven't really remembered it until just kind of talking with you now, but in the corner of my mind, I'm almost hearing like unusual sounds from Sam's background when I was talking to him. And I think it was probably, maybe he had some loud birds. We didn't have FaceTime or anything, so I couldn't really see his house or what it looked like. But I know I remember him being very excited when he went off on his own and did the Maxx, and we were still communicating with each other. And he was talking about how much they gave him to option the Maxx for the MTV channel. And I think he was just blown away. I think he got like $1 million contract to do the Maxx. And he goes, Don, he's almost like dumbfounded. He goes, he goes, $1 million is $1 million. And I was just so excited for him. And I thought, wow, that's really great that you got, someone to do an animated series, and they paid him good money. And I don't know if he still makes royalties on that, but he seems like he's pretty set. I think he's got such a, with the Sandman following and the Maxx and trade paperbacks and all that, he's probably not hurting. And I know his original artwork will go for, you've seen it, thousands.
Big money. People who are Kieth fans, I mean, I would know because I'm one of them. We have to have all the covers and all the trade paperbacks. And I mean, behind me, I've got sealed boxes and toys and VHS of Maxx and everything. And yeah, I know he still gets checks off of the Maxx. But perplexingly, I think it almost upsets him as much as it makes him happy and comfortable to be able to do what he wants to work now. I think in a lot of ways he's very upset that people have never moved on from the Maxx. And he had... I'm not going to get into details. I've talked to a lot of people like yourself, like who have known Sam over the years, and there was a lawsuit that occurred during the Maxx television show that seems to have completely taken the wind out of Sam creatively. Really? Yeah. I was going to ask, because I know you said that you guys were keeping in touch whenever he was starting, and if you look at interviews when he first signs that contract and he heads into the MTV stuff, he's very hopeful and very, very energetic. And I'm trying to think of how to word this really well. There was a couple of individuals that sued MTV over a aspect of the design from the Maxx. And MTV essentially took the standpoint of it was not their problem and passed the suit off to Sam. And that, it was very interesting. I've read 2 interviews and talked to everybody involved. And I can't, unfortunately, everybody's got, gag orders and this and that. And I really don't want to step on anybody's toes. But it's interesting to hear that he was so hopeful going into the Maxx, because it really just feels like at some point somebody took the wind out of his sails. Do you talk to him at all anymore?
No, I haven't talked to him probably since the late 80s. I kind of lost contact with him, and he went off to Image, and I was just kind of doing my indie thing, and he started hooking up with the big guys like Jim Lee and Liefeld and
I didn't know, because he did those covers for you, Pummeler and a couple other things for Parody Press,
Yeah, that was true. Gosh, I really wish I had my Rolodex. You used to have that. He probably has the same number that he's had for years, but I didn't know where that went, and I don't have it on my cell phone anymore. But I bet his agent would probably do me a solid and put me in touch with him if I asked him, and I'm sure Sam would probably be receptive to that. So I'll try to reach out and see if I can reconnect. But he's the kind of guy that probably he would have called me and probably been able to cry on my shoulder at the time, but for some reason we just when all that stuff was going down, I wasn't there for him, and I was starting a family and things, so it was kind of a hard.
Well, and I'm on the outside, obviously, looking in. I don't know any of you guys, and this is all just stipulation from research and little tidbits of interviews and stuff that I've read, but it feels like Sam very much shut himself off from his entire life, like all of his previous contacts. Because really, honestly, man, when you read about people that he's worked with, that he's had ongoing relationships with, there is only 2 names that I know of that throughout his career keep popping up, and he has nothing but nice stuff to say. And it's you and Bill Messner-Loebs. And, well, I mean, honestly, he's so, it seems like he was honestly so grateful for, being given the opportunity to pencil, but that he talks about how much he learned working with you, which is why it was so interesting to find out from you that he was involved with, kind of co-plotting stuff, because I'd always wondered about that, and he didn't receive credit for that. So
yeah, I mean,
Seems like he feels like he learned a lot.
Yeah, I mean, his idea was to make this Fidel Castro look like Zappa and the the Toe Jam Monster was probably, you know, a lot of his creation. He just had a silly, fun sense of humor. You can just kind of tell, you know, he's got, you know, Max the Hare, and he did, what else did he do?
Really, I mean, before Radioactive, not much. He'd done Critters, he'd done Sensational Comics, a few, you know, Comico, but really, he inking on Mage was like, that was his big claim to fame, you know. Hey, I'm working with Matt Wagner, completely miserable, but
Yeah, they probably didn't pay that great either back in the day. I remember getting a lot of those Kamiko books, and you know, God love them for trying. They were probably just a lot of guys like me and Parsonovich on the East Coast trying to do comics, and everybody starts somewhere. But Sam was just a guy that was so easy to talk to. You know, he was shy, but he was super low key, super friendly. Just a fun guy to talk to and hang out with whenever I had the chance to see him at conventions. And now I miss talking with him. I hope that we can rekindle our friendship.
yeah, and I don't want to pry, but it's interesting to me that you did remember his wife. That is something that I think has been kind of like blown out of proportions, not only by Sam himself, but by people as interpreting Sam from the outside. I was curious, I know this is really stretching. Do you remember how you learned of that? Like, because you said that you guys' relationship was mostly over the phone, so I'm curious if he was so so self-conscious and uncomfortable even at that point that he was bringing it up in conversation.
Um, he really wouldn't go into much detail about his wife. He was just telling me that, you know, she's much older than I am, and maybe, you know, because he was just let's see, what year was Sam born? Do you know?
Oh man, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I know his wife is about 15 years older than him.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So if I was, see, I was born in the early 60s. So when he was doing Hamsters, I was, you know, I was in my mid 20s. So if he was around the same age as me and his wife was, you know, 40 something maybe at the time. Yeah, that, you know, back then that was kind of unusual. So maybe, you know, I don't know if he felt self-conscious about it or what, or I don't know how they met, but I think they were together even when I first initially met Sam.
From what I understand, like one of the big, again, looking in, I tried and I really didn't bring it up in the big retrospective I did about him because I don't feel like it actually has as much bearing on him or his career as much as he thinks it does. But it is something that he continuously brings up. I think he was technically underage when they got together. I think was one of the big things for him. I believe he was 16 or 17 when they got together, and she was a decade older, so it was kind of a chintzy thing.
That kind of rings a bell now that you bring that up. Yeah, maybe he didn't want her to get arrested.
I was just curious because that was earlier, and I just looked it up. Keith was born in 63, by the way.
Okay, so he's my age. So yeah, you don't want to have. I guess you don't want to go shouting that out on the rooftops that your significant other is.
Well, obviously you don't, but it's interesting, you know, when we're having this conversation and you're just peripherally remembering things. And you're like, I remember birds, and wasn't there something about his wife? It's so funny to me that Sam drives home and brings up it. It's one of the things that makes me believe that he is as awkward and has as much of a problem with himself as it seems like he does in interviews in real life. Because it seems like he just brings up things continuously like, oh, I have a problem with this, so let's talk about it for 15 minutes because it makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, he's an odd cat. He's fun, but you know, he definitely has his idiosyncrasies just like everybody else. And I don't think he's tortured by any means, but maybe after that lawsuit, that can scare a guy, especially a creative person who's already sensitive and kind of.
And do you know the story behind Sandman #1?
I can tell you where I was in the timeline. I mean, as far as the dynamics between the creators, I don't know that much about what.
Well, I mean, you guys were talking, that you said you were keeping up with him around the late 80s, and when he drew that initial issue for Karen Berger, the editor on everything, I think he turned in 40 or 50 pages, and she was like, "No, this is trash. We're not paying you for it. Go back and redraw the entire thing for free." It seems like that was when he took a very big step down ego-wise. The ha-ha funny Sam that you talk about, which is very omnipresent in interviews from about 1988 prior,
Yeah.
vanishes very quickly. And Mike Allred had a very similar experience with Karen Berger, where he tried out for Sandman, and she just eviscerated Mike Allred. She was like, "You're not ready. This is complete crap. We can tell you're a good artist, and this is crap. We're not publishing it." Well, Mike Allred turned around, and he's literally, I did a nice piece on him where it was awesome because Mike Allred had said that's the whole point of his career, was proving, nope, Karen Berger was wrong. That's where Madman came from, Creatures from the Id. He was like, I was going to show that bitch what for. I could draw a comic. And Sam seems to have gone the complete opposite direction. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with the term imposter syndrome. So, imposter syndrome is essentially refers to somebody who refuses to admit that they have any actual ability that has driven them to where they're at. It's all luck. It's all chance. It's nothing has to do with their skill. And one of the things that is very, very defined for imposter syndrome is that they bring up fate and chance, and they downplay their skill. And that's something that I hear you saying, like, I was wondering, I've heard you talk about how jovial he was and how easy he was to work with. How hypercritical was he of his work at that period? I know he was still expanding and growing, and he talks about having a really fun time on Radioactive. It seems like that might have been one of the few experiences he had where he didn't get super introspective and beat himself up about art.
Yeah, I think we ran a loose ship because Eclipse, like I said, was more of a laid back office than DC and Marvel obviously were back in the day, and we had free reign. I mean, the Hamsters, I really wasn't edited that much by Kat Ironwood. She was. We were often late, so if anything, she would probably get upset with us just because we weren't meeting deadlines. But for the most part, they let us do whatever we wanted. There wasn't hardly anybody saying, this is trash, you got to redo it. That could be probably something that Sam was enjoying. And that's kind of why I like doing independent comics, is you've got, not to say that the quality isn't, as good as the big two, because I think in a lot of ways they are even better than what Marvel and DC are putting out. But it just doesn't feel as corporate, and it feels more from the heart. It's not like we're just out here to make a dime, and we are out here to make a living, but we want to have fun at the same time. And so, with the title like Hamsters, it's a fun title. You can read it and you can laugh. It's not heavy. It's not going to bum you out. And I think at the time it was just kind of what Sam needed. And I was appreciative that I found somebody that I thought was a really good artist that could at least try to do a few more issues of the Hamsters. And he did. And I think he did a really good job. I would love to see all the issues of the Hamsters in color someday. Dynamite Entertainment has the intellectual property rights to the Hamsters now. So I'm not able to do like independent projects on my own with them. I would have to get their permission, but they own pretty much the whole past library of the Hamsters printing rights. And other than Target Airboy, which was the only Hamsters book that ever was in color with Eclipse that Sam drew, none of the issues were in color. They were all black and white or 3D. So the only other color books were what Dynamite tried to do in a relaunch, like in 2007. But that was like a totally different creative team than what we were doing in the 80s.
All right, so I'll stop beating the Sam Kieth thing over the head. Let's talk a little bit about Parody Press.
Cool. So Eclipse kind of folded, Roman, in the 90s. They were just kind of having some money problems, and there was a flood down in their town that wiped out their inventory. So things were just kind of looking a little bit on the ropes for Eclipse. And so one of the books that I did for Eclipse after the Hamsters was X-Farce, which I think I have a copy of that. So I think in 92, after Liefeld released X-Force, I went to Eclipse and I said, why don't we spoof Rob Liefeld? And so I said, I've got this idea for a book called X-Farce. And so I pitched it to them, and they said, sounds like a great idea. Let's find some artists. So the editor of the book, whose name was Valerie Jones, she knew a couple of artists from San Diego that were working actually at SeaWorld doing caricatures, the guys that you pay like $25 and they'll draw your picture and give it to you. So Bill Mouse and his friend Bob Hannon were these guys that Valerie knew. And so she put us together on this X-Farce book. So that was the very first time I ever worked with Bill Mouse, and we hit it off really well. He was from San Diego, I was from Northern California. And so Eclipse folded. So we thought, well, maybe we can publish on our own. And so we came up with the Unfunny X-Cons, which I think I might have a copy of right here. By the way, X-Farce sold great. It sold like 60,000 copies, and it was just a black and white book. And so I think it was probably one of the best-selling, satires of the 90s. And so Todd McFarlane actually told Val that he was going to do our cover, but then he backed out. So I think it probably would have sold more if it had a McFarlane cover, but I'm not complaining. It still did well. So Bill and I said, well, why don't we do another spin-off of the Mutants parodies? So we came up with the Unfunny X-Cons with variant covers. We did one that was kind of a Kirby cover, one that was like a Jim Lee cover, and one that was like a spoof of Giant Size X-Men #1. So they all had the same interior contents, black and white, a black and white story, but we had, this is like the beginning of variant covers before everybody knew about them. So we published this, and every edition sold, I think we sold 20,000 in each edition, which for a small publisher, selling 60,000 comics again. And I quit my day job because my wife and I saw there could be good money in this, especially if we can keep this up on a regular basis. So we turned our house into a publishing studio. We had copiers and computers, and back in the 90s, digital coloring was just kind of coming into its own. And my wife actually taught herself on Photoshop. Her name is Laura, how to digitally color. So a lot of the early books that we did were like some of the very first digitally colored things that people were doing, because we kind of saw Image doing that. And then we wanted to try our hand at it. And we actually got pretty good. We started publishing full color books like Zen, Intergalactic Ninja. So Parody Press had its own sister company too, which was Entity Comics. That could probably be another show in itself, but that was more of the superhero, sci-fi, fantasy side of our publishing. And then Parody Press was strictly humor, one-shots. We brought back the Hamsters with Parody Press. And so we were publishing, once the ball got rolling, maybe 4 or 5 titles a month, Roman, and we got nominated as a Best New Publisher of the Year for Diamond Comics, like in 1993. And at one time, our market share was actually bigger than Archie and Mad Magazine. So we were selling lots of books, and we had this assembly line, and we just had this kind of group of guys that kind of wanted to cut their teeth. And I look back on a lot of the books that we did, both the superhero and the humor stuff. I mean, we published some of Doug TenNapel's first work. He's the guy that did Earthworm Jim and Bigfoot Bill. Leinel Francis Yu, he's a big Marvel artist.
Wow.
Jay Anacleto is another guy that we first published. Another guy named Raph Ainko, who's doing Darth Vader for Dark Horse right now. So all these guys kind of jumped in, and we got them when they were hungry and they were just mailing off their submissions to publishers. And like you said, I do think I have an eye at seeing who's good. And, we weren't paying a whole lot, but at least we were paying something. And they got the satisfaction of seeing their books in print. And, it was fun. We launched a lot of pro guys' careers. I look in comics now, and it's not uncommon to see a guy that worked for us that's inking Batman or Superman, and it's pretty cool.
Can you talk a little bit? I'm sorry, I'm kind of taken back. I absolutely love Doug TenNapel's work. I think most people are aware of Earthworm Jim, but like he's done a couple of graphic novels, like Flank and a couple other pieces. Blew my mind. Can you talk a little bit how you got to know Doug? Did you work with him much? Did he just do a one-shot or?
He did a one-shot. Let me see if I can find it. I think I have it here. Actually, I did. I was just on a live stream with Doug last week on, there we go. We have a mutual friend named Mike Miller, and Doug is, he's self-publishing now, doing a lot of the crowdfunding stuff.
Yeah, I was gonna say he's going through Kickstarter to do a new book, man. I'm really excited.
He makes a lot of money. But he's in Tennessee now. He used to be a Southern California, San Diego guy, and so Ken Meyer Jr., who was another guy that I kind of met early in the '90s, he's actually the guy that I worked with on the Megaton book, which is like a totally other story. But Ken sent me a submission, and I liked his work. He's kind of a superhero type of artist, as well as a painter. And so Ken had his connections with a lot of guys down in San Diego, and Doug was one of them. And so in a roundabout way, I guess Doug, found out that Ken was doing work for us, because Ken actually did the X-Cons covers, all the three variants. So he was one of our first employees. So Ken knew a lot of guys, and Doug was one of them. And I think at the time, Doug was, I don't know if he was doing commercial art or what he was doing, but it was before Earthworm Jim. So he came to us with an idea. He says, I want to spoof Jurassic Park, and I have an idea for a book called Jurassic Lark. So we did this, and it's got like a gold foil cover on it. It's all UV coated, so it's pretty sweet looking. But you can see this is 1993. So his work, is very early in his career, and he actually went by a pen name, Roman. He went by the name Doug Graves.
That's why I didn't see it. I tried to research, and I was like, well, how the heck did I miss Doug TenNapel's name?
Yeah, so he just confessed to that on the show last week. He said, yeah, I went by a pen name, and I'm not exactly sure why, if he had to keep it on the down low. Maybe he had an agreement, not to work where he was currently working outside of that job. But I met him at a convention, he and his wife. That was the cool thing, is going to conventions like San Diego Con and actually meeting these people in person that you've been, collaborating with over the mail system. Because we didn't have the internet back then. If you got artwork, you'd have to draw it, package it up, and send it to the publisher. It would get there, in a few days, and then you would take it and scan it, and then do whatever lettering you wanted to do to it, or coloring or whatever, and then you send the artwork back. Nowadays, it's all digital. Everybody just scans files, sends them to X person, and they do their thing, and then they send it to Y person. So you hardly ever touch physical artwork anymore, and it's kind of a shame. I kind of miss that. I ask a lot of guys that are doing covers for me. I'm going, well, how much more is it if I want the actual physical artwork? And they go, well, sorry, there is no physical artwork. It's all digital on a pad. And I went, oh, that's too bad. But I do have Bill's cover for X-Force number 1, the Reloaded book, which is what we're doing, and we'll actually be selling that on our crowdfunding campaign. So our campaign is going to be kind of cool, I think, because people will have the chance to buy original artwork, whereas some books, because they're digital, they don't have original artwork. And do you collect original artwork, Roman?
I wish I had the money. I had a few pieces when I was younger. I was like you, I'm like mid-30s, late 30s, and collected some stuff in the 80s. I had some stuff. I've still got a Mike Allred original. There's some like guys that were up and comers. I definitely had like a piece or two of Jack Kirby and some Neil Adams stuff that I picked up and sold like a schmuck. And then some, well, I had a huge, most of my collection got stolen about 15 years ago. And I lost like probably 90% of the stuff that I really cared about in that. I had like a Herb Trimpe Hulk piece that I just absolutely loved. And like I had a Steranko sketch of Nick Fury. Yeah, it's not a fun time.
Oh, I hear you. I got the collecting bug for comics, but I also started to get into the original artwork. And I look back on ads in some of our old books of pieces that I was selling. And I was like saying, oh, I got this John Byrne Iron Fist page. I'm going to sell it for $65. And I'm looking at that. I had Frank Miller, Daredevil original. And I'm going, that probably is worth dollars right now. But I know, I look at that stuff and I went, wow, I can't believe it. Like Mignola, I don't have any of his pinups anymore. And, I picked it up for a song, and for what I was selling it for, I was making a profit, but I had no idea if I held on to those pages. I mean, I had some really cool John Byrne X-Men pages, and that Frank Miller Daredevil stuff was it was hard to come by. And I actually had a couple of his pieces, and the Bob Layton Iron Man when he's going through the drinking problem.
Oh, man.
I know.
The only arc that ever mattered about Tony Stark.
Yeah. Layton and I can't remember who else drew that, but his stuff was so, for the time, I mean, it was just really, really cool.
Oh, Bob Layton, I always loved his stuff. Even when he was doing his kind of phoning in some stuff for Valiant, I still thought Bob Layton was still killing it, man. He's always. You mentioned Leinel Francis Yu. What did he do for you?
Well, this is a cool story. Is that when we started doing superheroes for Entity, we kind of launched with Zen Intergalactic Ninja, which was an already established property that Archie had done, and he had a toy line and a Nintendo video game. And so Steve Stern, who was the creator of Zen, was looking for someone to partner with to do publishing. So we thought, well, parodies are fun, but I still have this love and affinity for superheroes. So why don't we kind of try our hand at superhero comics? So we did, and Zen was our flagship title. And I think one of the here we go. So this is the Entity Zen from like 1993. So not very long after Parody Press was launched, we decided to try Zen, and we actually got newsstand distribution on this, and we probably printed, to be honest, Roman, I think we probably printed like between the newsstand and the comic book distribution, like 100,000 copies. And it had distribution throughout the United States and Canada, and, on spinner racks and stuff. And it was, we advertised it as the best-selling black and white comic book, which it was. I mean, Cerebus was really popular at that time too, but numbers-wise, Zen was actually doing pretty amazing numbers. It was just a black and white book that Bill Mouse actually drew. So after the success of Zen, we kept on doing Zen miniseries, and we started doing color Zens and so forth.
I know, I've got a couple. I just picked up that 3Ds in that annual special that Sam did the cover for.
Awesome. Yeah. So then people started coming to us because they saw we were doing good titles, and we were doing some spin-offs of Zen, like Near X, Cyber Angel. So again, in another convention, I think one on the East Coast that distributors were putting on, back in the day, there were actually more distributors than just Diamond. You had Heroes World, and you had Capital City Distribution. So Diamond wasn't the only kid on the block. So there used to be these conventions, like I think Heroes Distribution was one in New Jersey. This might have been where I met the people that were doing Aster. Billy Tucci, who does She, he was a guy that kind of would be at these shows, and I got to meet Billy, and we might be doing like a collaboration on with one of his characters, but I can't announce anything yet. But long story short, Roman, people were coming to us and they were showing us their artwork at these conventions, because that's kind of what people do that want to break in. And so when I saw this guy named Oliver Isabedra, who actually wasn't physically there, he had kind of a marketing director that was based in the United States, because Oliver was in the Philippines and he was an aspiring comic book artist. And let me show you. So this is the Aster trade paperback. And so Oliver drew this. And when I first saw his work, I said, this kid looks like George Perez. And at the time, George Perez was huge. He was doing Teen Titans and what else? Avengers. And I love Perez. I mean, I loved his work. And when I saw this kid's work on this comic book proposal called Aster, who was almost like a Captain Marvel type of character, I loved it. And I said, I want to hire this guy. So Leinel was kind of in the wings with Oliver in this studio in the Philippines called Cats Studios. So Cats was basically an offshoot of Entity, but based in the Philippines. So these guys would send us their artwork all the way from the Philippines, and we would do our thing with it to make it color and put lettering on it and so forth. And so Leinel was doing a backup story in one of the Aster books. And so that's where he started to get his feet wet. So that's, I think, like Aster, we did 2 or 3 different miniseries with Aster. So I think Leinel came along on the second miniseries of Aster. And then there was a guy named Jay Anacleto, which some people may know as, he's mainly a cover artist now. And Jay did work on Aster as well. So that studio was kind of loosely related to the Whilce Portacio guys that were from Image. And he was doing something, tip of my tongue. What was it? Wetworks? Was that his?
Yeah.
So yeah. Whilce was a Filipino artist, and the Filipinos have a deep history. There's some really talented guys like Nestor Redondo, if you ever
I love Nestor Redondo. There is an incredible amount of guys who come out of the Philippines specifically, but they get no love, man. I just there's no discussion about them. They pop up. Usually they're flashes in the pan. You get some guys like Luis Jose Garcia that worked for DC for so many years that I think people they see his stuff and they assume it's either Neil Adams or Jim Aparo because he's just that omniscient with Batman during that period. And it's only now, after 40 years of that guy just being everywhere. You could not go anywhere between 1975 and 1990 to see Batman merchandise that didn't have his art on it.
He was great.
And nobody talks about any of these Filipino artists. So that's amazing. I did not know that you were hooked up with Cat and all of that.
Yeah. So just another one of those cool things that happened. And so we did Aster, and then Aster sold great. We did, this is you've probably seen Chromium covers in your day. They don't really come out too much anymore, but I think it was Bloodshot that was like the very first Chromium that kind of cut everybody's eye. Do you remember Bloodshot?
Oh yeah. I think Turok the Dinosaur Hunter might actually have been the first with Bart Sears.
Uh-huh.
And then everybody else was like, yeah, we got to do holograph and chromium. And oh God, I remember that explosion.
Yeah, Chromium was like, we did a few issues, and it's beautiful. I mean, it looks like it's kind of embossed.
When it's done right, it looks absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and then we Metal Militia was another comic book that we published, which is actually Huang Wen just did a Metal Militia graphic novel on, I think it was on Indiegogo and Kickstarter, but he just finished that, and it was basically reprinting the Metal Militia miniseries that he did for us. And Huang was another guy that was, he was doing Punisher for Marvel and maybe Alien Legion or something like that. But he wanted to create her own stuff, and that was kind of the cool thing with us, is that Marvel and DC really weren't doing that much create our own stuff. So people that were established were coming to us with their projects, and Huang was one of them. And Ken Lashley was another guy that brought one of his titles over to us. So we were doing all right. We had our own little niche, and we were kind of like a minor league Image. I think people were really impressed with our artwork. Our standard of artwork was really high. Writing was a little bit, up and down, but it was fun. I wish I kind of had a tighter rein on things, but we were publishing so many titles, it was kind of making my head spin. And so you can't have like the type of quality control, looking back, that I wish I could have had back then. There were some titles that I published with Parody Press that were pretty kind of raunchy, that I'm kind of not so, proud of saying that I did them. But I was young, and I think I've kind of matured a little bit since then.
So Parody Press put out a number of different stuff. I think mostly of note that for this interview, obviously, would be the Pummeler, where Sam did the cover, and then Spineless Man 2099, where Sam did the cover, and then you guys did the Tax, and that was a direct parody of the Maxx.
I wrote that one, and we did. There's 2 issues. Hang on a second here. So we did an ash can called the Tax 1/2. These are both black and white. And then the Tax full color comic book. And I think the ash can came out first. I had a guy up in my local hometown that learned that I did comic books named Mike Taylor. And he really drew very much like, kind of organically like Sam. And he told me he was a big Sam Kieth fan. And so in some roundabout way, I put Mike in touch with Sam, and he actually got to go down to Sam's studio and intern with him. And so he was just like, for a high school kid, he was just in cloud 9, working with a seasoned professional and learning, how they work. I don't know if he just sharpened pencils. I think he said he actually did a little bit of inking on one of Sam's project.
I talked to him because you put us in contact on Facebook. I talked to him. He said he ended up drawing some backgrounds, doing some inking. The really cool thing that I thought about the entire story when I was talking to Mike, because I'm going to be interviewing him as well, was that he actually still talks to Sam. He and Sam actually got along so well that when they were trying to do, I can't remember what he said they were trying to do. Maybe they were trying to do the new Hero Initiative story for the Maxx, but that nobody could get a hold of Sam. Like, nobody at Image even knew how to get a hold of him. Like Jim Lee, Walt Sportazio, all these guys who'd work with him. And I was talking to Dan Fraga about it, too, because he watches some of my videos. And I asked Dan Fraga, and he was like, no, man, Sam was just like a ghost. You didn't see him there. Nobody talked to him. And when I was talking to Mike, he was like, yeah, they actually called me up and asked me how to get a hold of him.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I thought it was great.
So Mike, I kind of lost contact with him, and then on Facebook, I friended him, and then he's like doing video and directing down in Hollywood. So that'll be an interesting interview with him.
I'm really looking forward to talking to him. He seems like an absolutely just cool guy, man.
Super cool. And, if things go well with relaunching Parody Press next year, I would not put it past us to try to re-release the Tax, maybe in a color.
Thank you for sending me scans of those, by the way. I am a huge Maxx collector, and like those are some of the most prized Maxx pieces. I've been looking for those for like 20 years. And I've never even seen the interior. So when he sent me scans, I was like, oh yes, wow. It's crazy to see how much Mike really does look like Sam.
Yeah, I might have to send you one of these. We'll see.
What? You've seen how much those things go for on eBay, man.
I was stunned because I looked it up. Every once in a while I go on eBay and I'll type in Parody Press just to see what's moving, if anything. And I see people getting them CGC graded, and that's really cool to see that. But when I saw somebody selling the Tax that it sold for like $300, and I went, why? And then I just kind of went down the rabbit hole and I saw, wow, there's this whole Facebook group that's dedicated to Sam. And I've been in that group for like a year now, but I had no idea the rabid following that Sam had developed. I mean, it's almost like the way I felt about Bernie Wrightson, but he's somebody that I know. So it's kind of weird that he's idolized by so many people, and yet I know him and he's very down to earth.
It's funny you bring up Wrightson because I'm right on that age cusp. I'm a little bit younger than you, but a little bit older than a lot of my viewers. And I myself am an absolute Frank Frazetta, Bernie Wrightson are, there's God, and then there's, Bernie Wrightson, Frank Frazetta, and Kieth is right underneath there for me. There's some of the guys that I think when you look at their work, at least from their period, I think nowadays you can look at Alex Ross very simply and say, that's fine art as well. But looking back on Sam's stuff, and even his black and white material that you see in Radioactive, there's the pen work and some of the brush work and stuff that he was bringing to those books was absolutely incredible. So I think he has become this generation's Bernie Wrightson in a lot of ways. And it's interesting as well to see the parallels with, Wrightson messing up his wrist in the 80s and then kind of receding back from his work, and Sam doing that in the 90s where he receded back and coming full circle with this cultish following of people. Because it was funny when I went to reassemble my Maxx collection, those were dollar books. I never paid more than 50 cents for a back issue of the Maxx in my life. And then I came back after my collection got stolen and I was like, the issue 35 is a $50, $60 comic now. And I was like, wow, okay. Well, I guess I'll just move on to the stuff, I really wanted to get the Spineless Man and Pummeler and a couple other things that I remembered from my childhood as just being these iconically gorgeous Sam Kieth. That Pummeler cover, man, where he's shooting the bunnies out of that gun, it just bleeds. If that doesn't sum Sam Kieth up as a person.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite. When he delivered that to us, we owned the original artwork for that for a time.
Really?
Yeah, we owned it to work on it. But I think at the time, the agreement was he does the artwork and then we ship it back to him. So he kept the rights to own the original artwork. I do have, I think, a Hamsters Kieth page somewhere down, in my storage that I have, but I didn't get to own much of his, the Hamsters artwork. So I've seen it for sale. I know people have probably sold it in online and stuff, but yeah, that was cool just to behold that when he inks himself, as much as I like the guys that inked the Black Belt Hamsters books that he did,
yeah,
there's really nothing like him inking himself, because you can tell he's going to put in like 3 or 4 times more work than
mm-hmm.
the guy that's getting paid, a page rate. So the covers, he was back in the day, Roman, he was like $1,000 for a cover. And that's the same thing that Jay Lee was back in the day. And now I'm sure their rates have gone up quite a bit since then. But, for a small independent publisher, that's a hunk of change to pay for somebody with a name brand. And, at that time, Sam had kind of ascended with Sandman and Max. And so, I wasn't getting the Hamsters friend discount. He had to make a living too. And I respected that. And I felt I got every penny. You know, those books sold better because Sam's name was attached to them.
Well, and just so you know, it was very interesting when because I did very extensive, I did about a year and a half of research, and just talked to everybody I could. And when Sam talked about those covers, he was at a period where he had literally almost stopped taking any work from anyone, even Marvel and DC. He was hesitant to take on more work because he was doing, I think at the point when he did those, he was doing between 6 and 8 finished covers a month, interiors for Marvel Comics Presents, and then a 6-page story for something else as well, monthly. And literally he said they were, because somebody asked, they were like, and then there's Spineless Man and Pummeler, and he's like, yep, and I did those because I got to draw Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters, and that dude is the coolest dude in the world. It was one of the things. It was one of the things that made me actually want to seek you out. Like when I saw you commenting, I was like, oh, I got to jump at talking to this guy. Because every time Sam brought you up, he spoke so highly, and it just seemed like you had such a magnanimous personality. And to be able to get through to somebody like him, who is such a withdrawn and self-effacing artist, I think says a lot about your personality.
Thank you. I think that it helps just because, I'm a guy, and I'm not always the best listener, but I think that was kind of what set me apart from other people, is that people could just call me and I would talk to them. Like Dringenberg and I, when we were doing our fantasy series for Enchanted, I mean, we'd have like 3-hour phone conversations, and like your ears sweating. Sam didn't keep me on the line that long, but it was just really a smooth, no headbutting conflict. It's very rare for me to get in a bad relationship with creators, and I think that's important, because it's such a small industry. If you burn bridges, before long you're not going to have anybody to work with. And so jumping back into the industry, which is, the last thing I did was in the early 2000s, and I just published a little parody with Bill Mouse. So I actually haven't written anything since like the late 90s, and it's uncharted territory, the way that the whole marketing is set up, and people have YouTube channels, and it's cool. I mean, I like it because I think people can interact with their fans easier than ever before. But as far as it being a business model, because Diamond is kind of on the skids, and there's DC's, in a bad spot right now. It seems to me like crowdfunding is kind of the wave of the future. And I kind of feel like I'm getting on that wave right at the right time. And I'm blessed in that it's not my only income, because I'm a real estate broker, and I've been a real estate broker for over 22 years, and I do well with it. So that's the nice thing about getting into it as a more mature person, is that I've got the budget. I'm not on a shoestring. I don't have to say to my creators, well, if we make a profit, you get X%, but if we don't make anything, at least you're in print. That was some of the ways that we did our books back in the early days. We would basically say, I don't have a page rate. It's just strictly profit sharing. And we actually made profit and people got paid. But there were some books that you'd solicit and you wouldn't get enough orders, and you just have to say, sorry, we're not going to print this book. And so you kind of learn the hard way. But, some of those books did really well, and some of them, just kind of broke even. Some of them took a loss. But for the most part, most of our books, were done on a shoestring budget. And so we're kind of like the trauma of comics, making these,
I can see you as a very Lloyd Kaufman guy, man. He seems like the most lovable dude in the world. He just gets along with everybody. Everybody loves Lloyd Kaufman,
Yeah.
I think your work is a little bit above trauma quality. Let's talk a little bit about what caused Parody Press to come to an end, an entity, and all of that. When did that all wind down? What caused that?
Well, you probably remember in the 90s, everybody and their brother were doing variants and Death of Superman, and just the speculation, after Force came out and Spawn and all these books, it just became such a speculator's market that I think dealers were overbuying number ones, thinking they were just gonna, make a killing on them. And I think they overbought and there was too much product, and I have to take responsibility because I was one of those publishers that was, selling 30,000 copies of a book, and that's a lot. I mean, and if you triple that, and you've got other publishers doing the same thing, it doesn't take too long for the writing on the wall to see that how long can you sustain this? How long are collectors going to be able to pay and keep this mentality up of buying multiple copies of the same issue? And so I think kind of greed crept into the business, and it in the 90s we just started to see our sales start to kind of decline, and I think that coupled with card shops kind of having a baseball strike that kind of hit at the same time. I heard that a lot of shops kind of closed up in the mid 90s. And so when I saw distributors folding, leaving us with unpaid bills, we went down from maybe like 9 distributors down to like 3 in a year. And unfortunately, you send your comics to these distributors on good faith that you're going to get paid like in 30 to 60 days. But unfortunately, when you sent your comic books to these 9 distributors and 6 of them fold and you don't get paid for what you sent them, it becomes a domino effect. And so we couldn't pay our printers. And, we had to go through a bankruptcy in the 90s. And so I had to figure out how to reinvent myself outside of comics. And thankfully, real estate opened the door and I got into that. I was successful at that. But I think even Marvel had to file for bankruptcy during the 90s.
1998.
Yeah. So it wasn't just me, because, I didn't know what I was doing, but obviously it was affecting everybody. And so that's kind of why I got out of comics, is because I needed to make a living for my family. And I couldn't figure out a way to sell enough comic books to do that.
All right. I mean, that was what I had figured. The entire industry bottomed out. I was talking about the Max earlier. You can get issue 1 for probably 50 cents still. Issue 35, $60 issue. That tells you what was going on with, order numbers just across the board, because that was Image. Those were the big dogs. That's what everybody was specking on at that point. So Parody and Entity kind of just shuttered doors, and you went on and you've had a successful career for yourself. You're now coming back to restart Parody Press with Beard Zerker and a couple other things, right?
Yeah. I got X-Farce Reloaded. That's our first book that'll probably be coming out around March or April of next year. And what we did, Roman, was we took, it's going to be 48 pages, full color. And so X-Farce, which was the original book that Bill and I worked on back in 92, we're recoloring that in full digital color. And we also have a 10-page kind of a Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, X-Men spoof in that as well, that Mark Lewis is drawing. And I think I sent you the graphic of his X-Cons homage of issue number 4.
You sent me the interior, like 1 or 2 of the interior pages, and it looks absolutely incredible, man. I'm stoked to read it.
Yeah, that one is, I grew up kind of collecting the old X-Men, and somewhere I have not been able to find this, but I got Jack Kirby to sign like issue number 2 at a convention. I had it like in a Mylar sleeve, and I've been looking for it for years. I don't know if someone took it, but it was like, besides that one and Fantastic Four 48, which he signed for me, those are like the 2 things I would, basically want to give to my grandkids on my deathbed. And I cannot find them anywhere. And I've moved like 3 or 4 times, and somewhere I'm hoping in my stacks of comics, those are there, because they were like my babies. But I actually got to meet Kirby at one of these creation cons, and he was super cool and signed, those 2 books. But long story short, I love Kirby. I grew up I love Machine Man. I love this stuff with DC, Commandy, Fantastic Four, all those things. But X-Men, is dear to me. I always liked the X-Men. So we just thought, let's bring back X-Farce. And so it's going to be about 70% previously released material, but that was never in color. That will be colored. And then the other 30% will be new material. So we've got guys that are spoofing the new latest like House of X storyline that Marvel's doing. And we also have the New Mutants, which I think I sent you a copy of the cover. And so it's fun because we're just basically taking 7 different X-Men spoofs and putting them all in one 48-page book. And so that's the thing that we're in pre-launch on Indiegogo right now. So if you go to xfarce.com, you can go to the pre-launch page. And when we eventually launch, if you go to xfarce.com, you can learn how you can support the project. So I'm hoping that we'll release it, the actual campaign in December of this year. And all we're doing is we're just waiting for a guy to do a video trailer. See, this is all new as a publisher in 2020 that I never had to worry about when I was a publisher in the 90s. No one had YouTube. You didn't do trailers to promote your book. But now you look at all the crowdfunding platforms, and when you go to their pages, they go, play the video. And you got almost like a cool 1.5-minute movie about what this comic book's going to be about. And I think it's really cool, but it just adds more time and more work into the marketing that it takes time. You have to hire people that know what to do with editing software. And like I said, you're very good. I bet you could make some pretty cool trailers for people. But long story short, we're excited. So we're getting back into that with X-Farce. And then Beardzerker is our parody of Keanu Reeves' Berserker that launched on Kickstarter just a couple months ago. Have you seen that book, Roman?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm a big Keanu fan. I love the Bill and Ted books, not books, but the movies, and they also did comic books, obviously. But so I just thought, well, how can I spoof Berserker? And so we're bringing back Beardzerker, which is basically what if Ted from Bill and Ted went into suspended animation for like 35 years, woke up in today's world, but had the body of like a warrior, but still the mind and vernacular of a 16-year-old. So he's basically going to be a valley dude, but he's thrust into 2020 where we've got all these different myriads of things going on and has to figure out what to do. And I know you're a big music guy. I've kind of seen your Facebook page and that you're a musician, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna have to check out your Bandcamp page, but I'm a huge music fan. I love rock and progressive, and I grew up listening to a lot of new wave and punk and stuff. But anyways, Berserker is kind of a heavy metal hero, so his power comes from the rock gods, and his weapon is actually a guitar that's also an axe, and it's got sharp blades on it, and he calls it the Shredder. So whenever he needs power, he calls on the rock gods like Eddie Van Halen and Slash and ZZ Top to give him the power to slay whatever enemy is in his path. So it's kind of got that weird vibe to it. It's got a lot of heavy metal and music references to it. And did you ever read Boris the Bear when you were young?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So you know how Boris kind of laid waste to all the funny animals.
Oh yeah.
So in Beardzerker, he's going to lay waste to all the millennial musicians that people don't like. So you're going to see all sorts of people that people like now kind of get filleted by a Beardzerker. So it's going to be it's a little violent. It'll be fun. That'll be a full color book also coming out hopefully first quarter of next year. And Bill Mouse will be drawing that one as well.
Awesome. And for everybody who's watching, there will be links in the description below for all of the different projects that we're discussing and all of that kind of stuff. You'll be able to go down there and easily click through and check out and read about this stuff and support it and, sign up if you'd like.
Thank you. Thanks, Uncle.
Oh yeah, absolutely, man. So let's you mentioned Megaton, and for me, Megaton is one of those absolutely magical little tiny. It was like an oasis. You know, Eric Larson first popped up there. I know that at this point everybody really poo-poos on, Liefeld. That guy revolutionized comic books. He, I mean, love him or hate him, X-Force #1 was one of the pivotal moments in modern comic history. You can't argue that. You just look at the sales, and he should be right there, with Jim Lee. Those guys all came from Megaton, and Megaton seemed to be run by people who were very much of your mindset of freedom and that had a very strong attachment and affinity to fans and fanzines and underground publications, which is something you've brought up repeatedly. That just makes me smile to no end, because those are absolutely overlooked. I don't know why people don't seek out what their favorite artists wanted to do before Marvel and DC started constraining them. Um, can you talk a little bit about your involvement with Megaton? And
I can. I'm excited. I've actually never spoken about that until now. I'm proud to be in Megaton Vet, and so what happened on that one, Roman, is that Ken Meyer, who was the guy that drew our Parody press covers, he he was sending his stuff out to everybody that was doing fanzines back in the day, and he said, "Hey Don, I got my artwork. An editor for Megaton likes my artwork, and he wants me to do a superhero story for him with my character called Feral." And Feral was kind of like he was kind of like a troubled, almost kind of like a Batman Wolverine type of character that had PTSD from from the war. And so Ken said, "Yeah, will you write the story for Feral that's going to be in Megaton?" And I think it was in Megaton 4, if memory serves me right. But I wasn't familiar with what Megaton was until he told me. So I tried to reach out to Gary Carlson, who was the publisher and editor of Megaton, and he sent me some issues. So I actually have a few back issues of Megaton. And lo and behold, Eric was, I loved his early work in there. I think he was doing Vanguard and Dragon in the early issues of Megaton. And you could just tell he was very dynamic for his age, and he had a lot of Kirby, esque, like larger than life. That's kind of what Eric is known for. And strangely enough, I think I saw his work. He did a fanzine that I have a few issues of called Graphic Fantasy, which is like the very first issues of Savage Dragon.
Yeah, Dragon.
This is worth.
Yeah.
I think they're worth a lot because he had a really low print runs, and you look at him and like the color registration on the covers is
totally off. Yeah, man, those are.
I have some Eric Larson Dragons because I was a fan of his. I think even before Megaton. So I think I saw maybe in Comics Buyer's Guide he was advertising his little fanzine, and I sent off for it, and I have these issues. But then Eric and I kind of developed a kind of a pen pal correspondence, and I used to write a column for the Comic Buyer's Guide called Superheroes, SOOPER, and it was just like a couple, it was about this long of a column in the Buyer's Guide, and I would just riff and make funny satire jokes like, what if Joker did this, and would just kind of make these funny jokes. And so Eric actually did these little every issue of the Buyer's Guide that I did a column on would have a guest person doing my logo for superheroes. And Eric actually did a superheroes logo for me at the time. And then we wound up kind of being back in with Megaton, although I wasn't writing or collaborating with him. But in a roundabout way, I was hanging out in the same group with Eric and Rob and who else was in that? I think Angel Medina was a guy that...
Angel Medina, yeah, he came in there. That was right as they were leaving. There was a lot of those guys who just ended. I mean, like, there were so many Image guys that were right there, guys that would go on to Marvel and DC in the next couple of months and just absolutely blow up by 1991.
So we were just kind of like, Gary was kind of like the East Coast Entity, probably before Entity. He was finding these guys and doing these fanzines, and so he and I kind of had a lot of things to relate to. And so then Megaton, I think, kind of did its run for, I don't know, maybe less than 12 issues, and he didn't do it anymore. But then he was starting to do work with Image, doing a series called the Big Bang Comics. And so if you look up Image Big Bang, it's almost like Gary wanted to create this universe of like 1940s type heroes. And Mark Lewis, who's the ex-cons artist that I showed you some of his work, he actually did a lot of work for Gary, because Gary could see Mark could replicate the look of the 40s comics better than anybody else. So when you look at the ex-cons number 4, I'm sorry, the ex-cons cover that we're doing for X-Farce, he did everything. I mean, the typography, the coloring, and he just nailed it. I mean, it looks like vintage Kirby, 1960s Kirby. And we even have a crispy version that we're going to be issuing that looks like it's been read, and it's going to have like stress marks on it and brown paper. And the very first 10 pages of the story, which is the ex-cons origin, the one that you've seen a couple of previews of, it has, we asked our colorists to make it look like it was 60s. So we actually kind of added brown spots to it and a tint of, like that kind of pulpy newsprint that we...
Oh yeah, the colors all half tones. I mean, like, I loved it, dude. I was looking at it on my phone and I was like, oh yes, finally. Yes, this is perfect, man. I was blowing it up. I was like, this just looks... I always wondered what, the stuff that you'd released would look like in color, because you really always went that extra mile with seeming to get artists who not only were super talented, but had an affinity for what they were doing. And your books, for parody books, looked absolutely stellar, man.
Yeah, we really tried, especially when we were doing the Image spoofs. I mean, even the Meadowlark, which is a Shadowhawk spoof, we did the engraved cover. Let's see if I can find that here. Yeah. Okay. Well, you probably seen Valentino's Shadowhawk, right? So this is Meadowlark, and we went to the extra mile of having this embossed foil cover, which is, it's indented, so it's raised up on the cover, just like Jim Valentino's book, because that book sold like crazy hotcakes. So normally we would be happy just to get, a fraction of the sales of these Image books, and we did really well. I mean, like our Spawn parody called Yawn did really well, and the Savage Dragon parody called The Sewage Dragoon, we were selling like 40,000 copies of the parodies, and so we did all right.
Yeah, there's a reason for it. It's I think one of the reasons, those tax issues especially are considered to be part of Max Canon collecting. It really is. It's interesting. I've loved talking to you and learning about all this stuff, because I wondered, I always saw your name. You just kept popping up. You were like this overlooking entity that I never knew much about. And to find out about like Megaton and like just some of the people you've worked with is absolutely incredible, man.
It was funny because I was tweeting on, I was on Twitter the other day, and Neil Gaiman posted a picture of him and Dringenberg together, like back in the 80s, probably at a convention. And then he also, I think he posted the very first Sandman ad that was from DC. Like he was reminiscing about that, and he mentioned Mike's name. And so I saw that tweet, and I said, I basically said hi to Neil, and that I remembered Mike, and he did some work with me before that, and Neil liked that comment. So I don't know what Mike's doing right now. In fact, I want to re-release some of the work that we did together. That was a fantasy book, And I went online to try to find where he's at. And he's almost like Sam. You cannot find Dringenberg anywhere. I looked up and paid, the find a person service on the internet, and you pay and you're supposed to get some valid leads. So I sent letters to both addresses that they said he could be at, and they were both returned to me. And I'm going, how do I get a hold of Dringenberg? He's very reclusive. He's really talented. I think people see him, and I think he's doing like Tolkien covers and stuff and painted stuff. And I have no idea where he's at. And I would like to get in touch with him to see if he wants to contribute to the next project, which is a reprint of Enchanter, which is an Eclipse book that we both worked on. And it was only in black and white, but I would like to remaster that and put it in color. Kind of depends on how our first two books do, but Enchanter was like a overlooked gem. If you looked at Enchanter, you would see Mike Dringenberg like at about 20 years old, and you just go, this guy's better than guys that are, twice his age. And you could just tell he was going to go places. And so when he and Sam and Neil got together to do Sandman, I just said, wow, I know this guy. That's cool.
But it's awesome because Sam was instrumental in calling Mike in. He actually was the guy who brought Mike in on the project. And I'd always wondered, exactly how they kept intersecting at one point or another in their career. And it's interesting, talking to you, it sounds like their first intersection where they probably first actually glued was on Radioactive, which is really interesting. It's so many lasting relationships came out of those early magazines, man.
Yeah, it is really wild. I think meeting Sam led to meeting Mike. Mike was another guy like Ken Meyer. He knew that I was doing publishing and sent me copies of their work. That's the way people did it back then. You would basically get these submissions from people. Some of it would be really bad. And then some of it, every once in a while, you get this jewel, and then you go, I got to work with this guy. And so that's the way the business was back then. We didn't email, pieces. We didn't have a website. We just did things the old fashioned way. And to produce that many books, without all the digital things that we have now, we were working long hours. My wife and I were burning the midnight oil, and we actually brought in our own pre-press equipment into our own office, which was in our house. So we actually had these pre-press machines that would print the film from the digital file to run for color separation. So we had this one room in our house that smelled like developer and toner, and I'd have to take out hazardous waste every once in a while. So we did that to cut costs, because back in the day, if you were doing a 4-color book, you'd have to pay for color separations. And so you would send your finished digital file to a person that had a color separation machine, and that would add a lot to your budget. To have to pay for color separations. So my wife and I did some math, and we said, we could buy one of these pre-press machines for like $90,000, but we pay for it in a year, because that's what we're paying to have color separations done out of our, off-site. So we were learning how to do all the pre-press and blueprints, and we actually did that even after the comic book business folded. We were actually doing pre-press work for not so much comic book people, but just, regular printers in general need that service, or publishers need that service. So we were doing stuff for magazines, and that's why we eventually left our office for Entity and Parody Press, started in Northern California. And then my wife and I moved to the East Coast, to Virginia, because that's where Bill Mouse lived. And we just kind of wanted a change of pace. And that's where most of the distributors were. So that's when we moved to the East Coast for about 4 years and published. And then the market kind of took a dive. And then we found out that our pre-press services could be used by somebody back in Northern California, where we were from. So we moved back to Eureka, and that's where I've been ever since. I've only lived in Virginia, or that's the only other place I've ever lived, is over, closer to Bill Bill Mouse. And so we kind of had Entity Comics West Coast and Entity Comics, East Coast for a little while.
So we've hit a little bit on Entity. Can we go into a little bit about detail about how Entity evolved? It sounds kind of like it Parody Press kind of allowed you to explore your more serious interest in superheroes and stuff. Can you talk just a little bit about Entity and tell us, what was going on with Entity? I know Zen obviously was probably the big thing for you guys, especially when you started, but I remember Entity for a few other things as well.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I think not to be content, and just to see how it would go. We just thought, we kind of got this parody thing down, but we know that there's this whole new market for superheroes that other publishers are kind of getting into, and they're doing really well. People like Image and Valiant and so forth. And to be honest, Roman, it's fun to do parodies, but you're pretty much one and done. After you've done one, you just kind of move on to the next popular thing. And it's kind of funny. I think I've said this online on a couple of shows before. Some people say, "Hey, did you ever get into any trouble? Did anyone ever kind of call you out for parodying their stuff?" And I said, the only cease and desist letter we ever got was for Pummeler from Marvel, because we did Pummeler, and then we did Pummeler 2099, and then we were going to do a one that never got published that had a Sam Kieth cover called Pummeler versus Sergeant USA, which was going to be Pummeler versus Captain America, or Punisher versus Captain America in a parody version. But we didn't get enough orders for that. But somewhere in the Parody Press books and Entity books, you can probably see an ad for that cover that Sam did, but it never saw publication other than in the ads itself. But we got a cease and desist from Marvel, so we kind of pulled the plug on that because we didn't want to get into legal trouble with them. But that was the only time that anybody ever said we didn't approve of you doing a parody. So anyway, segueing back into Entity, we thought, well, this Zen opportunity came into our lap, and we knew it was an established character. And so we thought that's less risky because people are familiar with it. He's got a toy line, he's got a video game, and basically we could kind of partner with an established character. So we took it on, and it did great. I mean, we did so many Zen books, probably 50 different Zens over the years. And I'm still friends with Steve Stern, who's the creator of Zen. We had a really good run. We started with black and white, and then we eventually went into color with Zen. And at that time, our numbers were good. And so we started to expand. So we did, like Aster was the one I was telling you that Leinel Francis Yu and Cat Studios went on. And then, we kind of took new artists that had ideas, and they would either give us like a 3-issue miniseries or a one-shot, and we try them out. So nothing really endured or caught fire, I think, as much as Zen and probably Nira X Cyber Angel, which is another character that Bill Mouse was she was a supporting character in Zen, but then she kind of took on a life of her own when all the bad girls kind of came into play in the 90s. You had like Razor and Cinder and Helena, Nira X, so it's almost like this bad girl explosion was what everybody wanted to collect. And so Nira actually is still going to this day. Bill still has the rights to Nira X, and I think he just finished the Kickstarter with her, and he made his budget, and so he's still doing that. But Entity was kind of our brother and sister company to Parody Press. We never really did anything between the two, but it was just kind of our foray into doing more serious commercial books. And probably one of the other titles that people didn't, maybe you saw it, but we got the license to do Stargate. We were the very first publisher for the Stargate movie, which came out like in '96. And so we were just at a San Diego con with our booth, and we had a pretty good presence. And a guy came up to me and said, I'm the licensing representative for Stargate. And we're looking for a publisher. And my wife and I had seen the movie in the theater that year, and we just thought, we really like this movie. So we got the rights to do the movie adaptation, and then we did a few miniseries and spin-offs of Stargate. And then our license expired, and we kind of closed up shop in the 90s, late 90s. But then Stargate went off to, I think Dynamite has the license for Stargate now, but that's a good TV series. I don't know if you like Stargate, but
yeah, no, I used to watch that and Earth Final Conflict and a couple other things back to back.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, I'm a big sci-fi geek too. I love Star Trek and Star Wars, and obviously the cheesy movies we were talking about, like Phantasm. And,
oh man, Phantasm is like that's like a spiritual thing for me. I'm obsessed with Phantasm. One day I will meet Don Coscarelli and shake that man's hand.
Yeah, that guy's he's a undeveloped, not undeveloped, but underrated.
He really is, man. I mean, I think people like to take things at face value. Phantasm looks cheesy, but the further you look into that, the more you can tell there's so much love and attention and to detail that's put into that movie. You look at the soundtrack to that film, and it's one of the first ever, Malcolm Seagrave and Fred Morrow, they did that. That was one of the first ever fully electronic soundtracks done in America. Yeah. And that theme song is if you've seen that movie, it is as recognizable as the Halloween theme, and that's saying something. It really showed his attention to detail and how much he loved stuff, which is interesting because I see all of that translated directly over into your stuff with like Parody Press, where even though it's fun and farcical and you really aren't poking fun at stuff, you had great art and there was just this love and appreciation of stuff, which makes Entity even more interesting to me to see that was your segue of using that as kind of a stepping stone to trying to be more serious and say something inside of the industry.
Yeah.
So
That's a nice compliment.
No, I think it's very intelligent. I think it goes back to you just kind of jumping off and doing something. Like you were like, I just thought you printed, 5,000 copies and then people paid you for them. And you were, you might have been wrong back then, but then 30 years later, where's that got you? You print 30,000 and people are picking them up. And I just think it's, a great testament to people who don't put in the time and effort and they don't think things are possible and they won't follow through on their dreams anymore, man.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm pretty much dive head first and ask questions later guy. And sometimes I have this entrepreneurial spirit in me from the time I was a little kid, and I always wanted to just take chances. And sometimes you fall flat on your face, but you just got to get up and dust yourself off and try again. I mean, if I was crushed by those first rejection letters and decided I never wanted to pursue comics, I wouldn't be talking to you today. I actually used that as fuel. When I got the rejection letter from Mike Friedrich, he actually said, "What is this BS?" He wrote us back, and we got this, and it just like, we were just high school kids, and we felt like, man, this really sucks. He doesn't like our stuff, and we think we're great. And so rather than use that as a downer for our career, we just said, well, we're going to show this guy, almost like what Mike Allred did with DC, So, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So we just kept on pushing, and probably a couple hundred comic books later, here I am talking to you, and you still remember my stuff, and that makes me smile that you've collected. And I appreciate your support, because you put in hard-earned money, whether you bought issues back then or buying back issues now. And everybody that supported our books, we wouldn't be here unless they were they believed in us as well.
Oh man, I remember getting the local store to order Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters, and the guy was looking at me because I read, a lot of like Dark Knight Returns and all this stuff that they really loved. But every once in a while, I get these books where they're like, "What the fuck is wrong with this kid?" And like they got him in, and I remember it was issue 6. It was that cover, and you know that Sam did where everything is just coming down. It is so dynamic and so beautiful. I remember the guy working the counter, Ryan, looking at me, and he nudged the guy Chaz next to him, and he was like, "I think the kid's onto something. We should order a few more of these."
Wow.
And you could see him flipping through.
You got a good eye, man. I mean, you're younger than me, but we have the same. I mean, just you knowing who Nestor Redondo is, that's really impressive. I mean, I liked a lot of the obscure guys just as much as the commercial guys. And growing up, you know, obviously John Byrne was huge, but did you like Michael Golden?
Oh, if Mike, I would still worship that man if he wasn't such a jerk.
Is he a jerk? I didn't know that he's a
Have you ever heard that? Not to get completely off the rails here, but like Michael Golden used to be one of my favorite illustrators, and I guess like he got basically bullied out of the industry. They don't want to hire him in the comics industry. I could not figure out why. Why does no one want to work with Michael Golden? Micronauts is one of those pivotal moments where like that series should be so trivial and so forgettable, and Michael Golden made that 30 years later, people are rapidly collecting that. They're talking about making it into a movie. That is for no other reason than Michael Golden's artwork, and I do not care what anyone says. So, like, Mike Golden, like, after he got bullied out of the industry, he relied essentially fully on commissions, and his commissions were expensive, man. Right around the internet, like blowing up with the forums, you know, as everything moves out of news groups and all of this stuff, like Michael Golden starts getting a bunch of people that are complaining about him not getting commissions done. And I guess there was a coalition of about 6 dudes who got together and finally were like, they got a hold of his agent, and they were very nice for about 2 years of being like, look, man, we paid whatever it was, you know, I think like $1,500, $2,000 for these pictures or whatever. We really would like an update. Oh, we're going to get it to you. Oh, we're going to get it to you. Oh, no, he just doesn't have time. He's doing this, blah, 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 blah. So these guys get together and they're like, look, we're going to either blast him online or we're going to get our stuff. And they ended up blasting him online. And Mike Golden, oh, dude. So Mike Golden, actually, the guy who like is considered the ringleader of all of this, sends him his picture, and it's a Doctor Strange commission, and his cape, and he's doing his hands and his magic, and he's got that crazy Michael Golden cape and all of this, and it says, patience is a virtue in the actual commission to screw with this guy who's waited like 2 years, has records of like 60, 70 emails sent back and forth, all of this stuff. No. So the best part of it is this guy is looking at his art and he starts laughing, and he's like, I realized after about 10 minutes of looking at the art, Michael Golden was so upset drawing this picture. It doesn't even say patience is a virtue. It says patience is a virtue. He forgot the fucking T in it, man. Like, that's how angry Michael Golden was when he was penciling, inking, everything that piece. And that apparently, him and Barry Windsor Smith are 2 guys that I just absolutely idolize, and that sums up their interactions with all of their fans.
Barry, I think I sent him a fan letter, and he wrote me back, and you know, he signed the letter, and I thought that was cool. But I never bought any artwork from him. Mike Kaluta seems like he's a decent guy. I really liked Mike Kaluta's work.
Mike Kaluta is a stand-up guy, man. Mike Kaluta's like Bernie Wrightson. I mean, they came from the studio. They know what sells comics is your fans. Interacting with people, appreciating those people, interacting with those people. You know, I mean, Kaluta, yeah, he got famous for all of his DC stuff, but where were the people that came from that bought his Warren stuff? His same with Wrightson, and they were very, very tied into that fanzine community and very, very intelligent and aware of what people wanted to see from them and talking to their fans and being respectful. I got a lot of respect for Mike Kaluta, Bernie Wrightson. Those guys they just seem like they're right on a cutoff, because there seems to be a change with guys like John Byrne and that kind of stuff after like the late 70s that were prominent by the late 70s, by about 1978. Their egos, man. Some of the stuff that I hear John Burns say about other guys in the industry is just appalling. Like, I really like you. Stop telling Chris Claremont to go fuck himself.
Yeah, Claremont just I just posted our New Mutants thing on his timeline because I'm a friend of his on Facebook, and he actually laughed at the New Mutants. I said, really like X-Men and New Mutants, and we're doing a spoof of it called the New Mutants, and that was just like last night. I think he liked it. So I'll send you a screenshot, but that made my day. I retweeted it, and I met him at a few conventions, and he signed a Man Thing. Actually, for some reason, I like Man Thing back in the day, as well as his X-Men stuff.
I love Man Thing, man. I'm a huge Howard the Duck fan, so you gotta love Man Thing just for the simple. So, is there anything that I missed? Is there anything, that you'd like to bring up, that you'd like to talk about?